Senator from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President and colleagues, today the Republican Party officially turns its back on America's middle class. Our constituents believe Congress must require multinational corporations to pay their fair share, ensure the middle class has the chance to truly get ahead, and protect Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Instead, Republicans are doling out new giveaways to the multinational corporations, raising taxes on the middle class after a brief sugar high, and taking away the Medicare and Social Security guarantees for the future. It takes hard work, Mr. President, to muscle a tax plan this unpopular and destructive through the Congress. Writing it is the easy part, especially when you're just checking off the far-right tax policy wish list. Normally, the hard part is sticking to your baseless talking points, ignoring the public outcry, and turning a blind eye to the loads of evidence that your plan is designed to fail. This process has certainly been as far from normal as it can get. Now, the bill comes at an enormous cost and represents a huge missed opportunity. For just some perspective, the $1.5 trillion Republicans plan to borrow for their tax bill would fund the Children's Health Insurance Program for 915 years. Let me repeat that. 950 years of a lifeline for families that are walking on an economic tightrope with CHIP. That's what you could get for the $1.5 trillion Republicans are borrowing to pay for their tax bill. Spent on infrastructure, it would build towering new monuments in the tradition of the Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge, and the interstate highway system. Aimed permanently at helping the middle class, it would give long-struggling Americans a meaningful chance to get ahead. But this isn't real tax reform or a serious solution to the major policy challenges of our time. This is a stimulus plan for shareholder goodies and executive compensation. Republicans are ignoring today decades of evidence that trickle-down economics is a fantasy. Republicans have cut taxes bit by bit for multinational corporations and high flyers, but we've seen wages stay flat. The benefits of those previous tax cuts never trickled down. In this debate, Republicans seized on a talking point about workers getting a $4,000 average raise hike if the bill becomes law. But that figure is based on a made-up revenue-neutral plan that was never on paper. It is fake math, plain and simple. Now, Mr. President, I want to issue a warning to the public today. Passing this bill guarantees years and years of instability in our tax code and painful, drawn-out battles over tax policy here in the Congress. Because of the pure partisanship and the recklessness of the process that went into drafting this legislation, the bill is already full of mistakes that are going to have drastic, unintended consequences. Down on K Street, they're already working overtime to exploit new special interest loopholes. The giant pass-through tax loophole, which has been widely covered in the business pages, is just the beginning. There are going to be big new incentives for multinational corporations to ship jobs overseas, and with that, you get more factory towns and mill towns going dark. Fewer Americans can have the kind of reliable manufacturing jobs that support a family. There's going to be extraordinary new pressures on state and local finances, and that's going to hamper their ability to build new roads and bridges and schools. And there are going to be new and annual fights over the stop-and-go tax policies. Around here, they're called tax extenders, and what they do, again, is ensure a lack of predictability and certainty we need for innovation and growth. All the evidence says that many of the policies in this bill are going to be a nightmare to administer. This means that with this bill, tax cheats get a holiday gift and have the opportunity to create new ripoffs. And what this means for the typical family who just wants to file and get a refund on time, for that typical family, there are going to be more hassles because the government is going to have to devote more time to try to catch the cheats. Mr. President, the defining economic challenge of our time is guaranteeing that the middle class and those that strive to be middle class have a chance to get ahead. Our country is home to the world's most powerful economic engine, and it generates levels of prosperity that have never been seen before. But working families and the middle class have been on the outside of the winner's circle for generations. The Republican plan isn't an answer to that challenge. In fact, it almost certainly makes the problem worse. At a time when the middle class needs fundamental, permanent reforms that give them a chance to get ahead, the best the Republican plan offers is a sugar high. And the fact is, it won't be long before the sugar high wears off and tens of millions of hardworking Americans will find themselves paying higher taxes as a result of this bill. Corporations, on the other hand, reap the benefits of permanent tax breaks and a loophole-ridden system that, in my view, just begs to be gamed. The trail of broken promises that Republicans have left behind in this process is long and unforgettable. Now, the President said his tax bill would not benefit his family or people like him. That's untrue. The Treasury Secretary said there would be no tax cut for the upper class. He was happy to have that called the Mnuchin rule. That is untrue. Republicans in Congress said the principal feature, the main feature of their plan would center on a middle-class tax cut. That's untrue. Republicans said their bill would make the system dramatically simpler. That's untrue. Republicans said their bill would allow families to file their taxes on a postcard. That's untrue. Republicans said their plan would pay for itself. That, too, is untrue. Even many of the promises Republican leaders made to their own colleagues have been broken. But there's one that they're not trying to hide. The deficit hawks have flown back to town, and they're already stirring up a battle over entitlement reform. And they're going to look at a variety of health programs and programs that are a lifeline to millions of Americans. But our people are not thrown off by the Washington lingo. They know that when Republicans say they're coming after entitlement reform, they've got the knives out for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, anti-hunger programs, education funding, and more. Now, our distinguished colleague from Wyoming Chairman Enzi was talking about how dynamic scoring would take care of things, and it was just off base to be concerned about these deficits, because dynamic scoring would make everything turn out fine. The reality is, all of the independent analyses have shown that this bill comes up way short in terms of projected revenue. The Tax Foundation, for example, which is not exactly a left-wing operation, said the Republicans were hundreds of billions of dollars short. What the Joint Committee on Taxation said is that the Republican plan was $1 trillion short. Now, to put it in context, remember that Steve Mnuchin said that this plan would not only pay for itself, but it would leave $1 trillion left over. And yet, both the Tax Foundation and the Joint Committee on Taxation says that this bill comes light years away from paying for itself. Now, colleagues, it didn't have to be this way. I see the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee on the floor. As I've indicated, Democrats believe that the tax code is a rotting mess and has to be fixed. For years, there's been bipartisan interest in getting tax reform done right. 17 Democratic senators came together, even in a last-ditch effort to try to bring some bipartisanship into the process, and laid out ideas for some common ground. I commend that group, led by our colleagues from West Virginia, Senator Manchin, and our colleague from Virginia, Senator Kaine. I've written 2 comprehensive bipartisan tax reform bills, first with Senator Judd Gregg, and then with a member of the President's cabinet, Dan Coates. Now, the majority leader always likes to talk about how nobody is interested on this side in bipartisanship. When Democrats laid out their principles, the first thing we said was how important it ought to be that we focus on bipartisanship. And that letter was shared with the Republican leadership. Then you have the group of moderates. Then you have the actual bills that were written. So this idea advanced by the Republican leadership that there was no interest in bipartisanship just does not resemble reality. And by the way, a lot of senators here know that we've got a pretty current example. The 2015 tax bill, just a kind of model of what you can do. Both sides had good ideas. Bipartisanship is not about taking each other's dumb ideas. Anybody can do that. But the 2015 bill, my colleagues on this side said the earned income tax credit ought to be expanded. And we wanted the child credit, the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And the Republicans, led by my distinguished colleague, Senator Hatch, had some pretty good ideas too. They wanted to make the research and development credit permanent and the expensing provision so important for farmers and rural communities. They had some ideas on business incentives. So what we said is we're going to find some common ground here. We're going to take good ideas from both sides. And the tragedy of this bill is that Republicans wouldn't build on the good work of the 2015 tax legislation, where good ideas were accepted from both sides. This time around, there was zero outreach from Republicans on this issue. Not one moment when Republicans actually shared even a piece of paper or a document about ideas that might bring both sides together. In fact, you can go all the way back to November 2016. They were still putting the voting machines back into storage when the first whispers began about tax reform happening through a completely partisan process. Now, In coffee shops across America, most folks are not talking about budget reconciliation. But budget reconciliation is Washington lingo for saying we aren't going to do this right. We're just going to make it our way, partisan, no effort to try to bring people together. And after those whispers in November 2016, within days, Chairman Enzi, the chairman of the Budget Committee, my good friend Senator Hatch, the chairman of the Finance Committee, everybody's on board. And then by December, the majority leader in December of 2016 made it official. We weren't going to build on the history of successful tax reform, which requires bringing both sides together. The majority leader said, we're going with reconciliation and partisanship. Reconciliation is a full-on rejection of the history of successful tax reform, and it's a full-on rejection of bipartisanship. It's the majority saying to the minority, as was the case, we just don't want your ideas because we don't need your votes. And when you look at the way this debate played out, it's obvious that has been exactly the approach my Republican colleagues have taken. The administration's first tax outline, which was shorter than your typical drugstore receipt, didn't contain an ounce of Democratic input. Then what we had with the Republicans are the closed-door meetings of what they called the Big Six, a Republican-only group to turn their outline into a framework for a bill. The framework they released, which was roughly the same size as your typical drugstore receipt, still reflected no Democratic ideas. Now, everybody knew that you do it this kind of way, and the public's going to catch on. They're going to see this as a con job, and they're going to catch on that this is going to give the middle class the shaft. So they decided we just got to move at the speed of light. That's what the House did. Here in the Senate, Republicans dropped their plan late at night just before Veterans Day weekend, and the Finance Committee was supposed to start the process of voting on it a few days later. There was a whole new version of the bill introduced in the middle of our markup, and it turned the tax bill into a health care bill. A health care bill with a fresh attack on the Affordable Care Act. There was another set of last-second changes introduced literally minutes before the final committee votes happened. The bill makes $10 trillion in tax policy changes, and there was never a single hearing on the specifics of the legislation. Let me just repeat that, Mr. President. I want the public to know that. There was never a single hearing, not one, on the specifics of this legislation. You're going to hear on all points a push by my colleagues on the other side to say there were 70 hearings. Well, sure, there were people who would come in from time to time and talk about issues. There wasn't one hearing, not one, on the specifics of the legislation. On the Senate floor, the Republicans played hide the ball for days until they dropped the final version of their bill late at night on a Friday. 2 full days of debate had already passed, and the final bill was a mystery. I stood here hour after hour asking where the bill was. An economy-transforming bill, a tax hike on tens of millions of middle-class Americans, and yet Republicans kept it hidden till the very last second. When it was revealed to the public, I saw my colleague, Senator Durbin from Illinois, holding it up with illegible notes scrawled in margins. There wasn't anywhere near enough time for any member of the body to read the bill and grasp each of its provisions. Even the conference committee was an exercise in reckless partisanship. News reports said Republicans had agreed on a final bill, but they were empty-handed at the only official conference meeting. So what was going on at this so-called conference meeting? And this was, I guess, a reality show version of a conference committee, is the conferees were supposed to ask questions about out-of-date plans from the other body in the Senate, while the actual final bill was still locked behind closed doors. The chairman didn't allow any motions or any amendments. Just like every other step in the process, this was a sham debate, and now the bill is a few hours away from passage. Mr. President, I close with this. This bill has the power to reshape the American economy in far-reaching and unforeseen ways. It has the power to send families into economic hardship. It has the power to threaten this country's ability to hold these special promises, to uphold these special promises of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And this bill was written in the shadows, written in the dark. Billions and billions of dollars worth of changes tumbling out at the last second, the result of special interest influence and hushed conversation in back rooms. No public hearings on the specifics of this legislation. And people wonder why the American people oppose it. Republicans have chosen to ignore them. Chosen to ignore them. What's happening is undemocratic. It is wrong. And I'm here to say this vote will not be forgotten. Mr. President, I yield the floor.